Welcome to State of Ed, a podcast about education inside the classroom and out. My name is Marc.
And I'm Nick Simone.
How you doing today, Nick?
Very excited for today. Doing very well. Yourself?
Also very excited. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Tracey Benson with us, who's the co-author of a brand new book called Unconscious Bias in Schools, a developmental approach to exploring race and racism. Dr. Benson is an assistant professor of educational leadership at UNC Charlotte and received his ED/LD at Harvard Graduate School of Education. And he's basically worked at every level of education imaginable. He's an elementary school teacher, a vice principal in a middle school, principal in a high school, and a PD specialist and a district leader in a number of states, including Texas, North Carolina, Florida, and Massachusetts. And also, while at Harvard, co-founded the Ethnic Studies course. So it is really a true privilege and a treat to have Dr. Benson with us here on State of Ed.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Mark and Nick. I appreciate you having me on your show. I've heard a lot of good things from a lot of people when I asked around about this podcast. So I'm very excited to be on.
Right off the bat, Nick and I are both doc students, and we're actually in a course on sociocultural learning and implicit bias. So when I started reading this book, it was a perfect overlay to the concepts and things that we're talking about in our coursework right now and writing about and reading about. So when you refer to unconscious bias, you say it's a form of racism. Can you kind of explain a little bit more about why you kind of equate the two?
Well, in our research when we study those who write about racism, so we study Glenn Singleton, we study Peggy McIntosh, Robin DiAngelo, Joy DeGroy, all these authors that write about the context of racism, racial bias, unconscious racial bias, implicit bias. In the end, it's all an offshoot of racism because racism is having a preference of, towards or against one particular racial group. And considering the history of our country, that the very foundations from our founding fathers it was founded in a very racialized context where we had white free men and women who relied on the forced labor of black and brown people during times of slavery over hundreds of years. It's sort of that sort of mentality of just the dehumanization of black and brown people in this country has residuals that carry on today. And so when we talk about unconscious bias, and the reason we use the term unconscious bias is because it has been in the education field a safer word than racism, because racism is just such a loaded term, as we say. It's become taboo, to call anybody racist these days, because that's like calling, that's the worst thing that you can do to a white person. And so even though we have many different levels of internalized racism, we use unconscious racial bias so that folks, they'll draw folks into reading the book, and then we can go through the understanding of how unconscious bias is a form of racism. And the definition we use for unconscious bias is the learned beliefs, attitudes, and stereotypes about a particular race that result in harmful or preferential treatment of members of that race.
When you go back to 1619, how familiar are you with the New York Times project, and what did you think about it, if so?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of controversy around different perspectives on the 1619 project, because of course we just passed the 400th year anniversary of the transatlantic slave trade, and I think for historians, in terms of thinking about our time in our country, which is, if we think about the legalized subjugation of black people in this country, um, from 1619, and we could say 1965, the civil rights movement, as the end of legalized subjugation. The black people in this country have been subjugated for 345 years. And so I think the importance of the 1619 project is bringing light and understanding to just how long racial oppression was in this country compared to the free time. If we consider our times to be free now from 1965 until 2020, that's only 56 years. It's a very, very short amount of time compared to the long time that black folks were enslaved or either oppressed. And so I think we need to keep that in front of mind and have the memory of that and the understanding of just how many generations that is affected and the residuals that sort of still are in society today, and how we need to have an equal and opposite response to then so that black and brown people, especially people of African American descent, are able to sort of to get the 40 acres and a mule, to have the field evened compared to the time that we were enslaved.
I've been, I'm a history, we're both history teachers, by the way, and I've been reading a lot lately about just the whole Reconstruction era and how that was really, like that was our opportunity to really begin the true equality that was long overdue. And with Reconstruction ending, so shortly after 12 years, that was such a squandered effort. Do you think people are just so unfamiliar with their history that we have to actually educate them first? No, I mean, I hate to sound so, because some things should be so obvious, and yet people just don't understand, what you've just said in a matter of a few minutes.
I think that we need to like I said, the equal and opposite response. And so we had a long hundreds of years of legalized subjugation that was just so normalized during that time. And I think right now, when we say have continued oppression and continued structures that are so embedded in structural racism, that it's become normalized. So one, I think it's consciousness and awareness raising. I agree with you there, Nick. And then on another end, it's actually the will. So where is the will to actually make good on our promise to bring folks back up to a place where the historical oppressions don't pertain to today. So I think a lack of knowledge and consciousness and awareness, but also I think there's a real lack of will currently until there's a time in which and what they write about in this concept in critical race theory is called interest convergence, where the convergence of the white population and the convergence of populations of color meet at a point, and then we have progress for all races. But that happens for so infrequently, and so I think conversations like this, having on your show, I have two white males and a black male who studies race talking, who are educators talking about race. I think this is very important in terms of raising people's consciousness and awareness till we get to a point where we understand the gravity of racism, and then we can move things forward.
Yeah, and in terms of history, I don't know if you had a chance to read Doug Blackman's book "Slavery by Another Name," but 1865 didn't by any means end slavery, or at least the actuality of being enslaved, or the reality of being enslaved, even though the civil rights amendments were passed. So, and that was such an eye opening book because I didn't realize how far reaching it was and how it went to the highest levels of the largest corporations in America and lasted well into the 1900s. And even as a history teacher, I didn't have a complete appreciation of the depth of that and the impact of that, the magnitude of that. You mentioned, obviously, here we are, Nick and I are two white men, and we're speaking with you about race. And in the book, your co-author is also is white. And right at the beginning of the book, you basically hang a lantern right on that for the reader, and you articulate that. And so, why was that so important to you to articulate? You pretty much right at the onset of the book.
Oh, because when we what we learned through the process of writing together is that I mean, of course we know, but just by the nature of who we are, we have different upbringings and different beliefs. And so when we got around to actually having conversation about what this book is gonna portray to audiences and what we're going to write about and how we want to frame the book, we have very different framings in terms of our understanding around race. And so we wanted to highlight in chapter 2 sort of the difficulties in reconciling that, because we did have two distinct audiences, um, audiences of color and also white audiences, and we all have sort of different ways that we're brought up in terms of our racial experience of society. And so in terms of coming together and writing the book in one voice, it was very hard because we spent, I think, three times amount of time discussing, arguing, debating, three more times amount of time than we did actually writing. We had some of the most intense conversations and disagreements and needing to go and do more outside research and getting together and over coffee to figure out how to bring our perspective and voices together so we can reach the widest swath of educational leaders regardless of their background. And so we wanted to highlight that in chapter 2 to sort of exemplify how hard this work is. We're just two people. Nonetheless, we're not principals anymore, but as a principal, you're a person running a group of teachers and leaders within a school building, and so the work is extremely tough, emotional, and also it moves very slow. But we wanted to highlight that we come from different racial backgrounds, because it's important to understand that our difficulty in work should exemplify just how difficult the work is.
Yeah, and I would add, on our level, that's the struggle I think we're having is people are not willing to have the difficult conversations. There's a lot of resistance just to even starting the dialogue. I think that's why, your role and your book is so critical for us. Because again, it's long overdue. We know that, but we can't turn back the clock. We have to move forward in the discussion. And there's just so much resistance on our level in the public schools.
Right, and we need to have, what I found through this process, and also being a high school principal, and I relied on an outside provider, and so I'm a black male who had a lot of interest and dedication to be lead for racial equity, but I still brought in outside providers to help me have the skill and ability to lead a faculty, and my faculty was all white. Through difficult conversation about racial identity, and so what we need to remember is the humility around any adult who tries to dive into this conversation with a group of teachers, because we're not taught this in K-12. We're not taught how to talk about race.
Right.
Actually, we're taught how to not talk about race. We're actually made racially illiterate through our education process, because it becomes so emotionally laden, and people quickly get defensive and worried about saying the wrong thing. And so one thing that I've done, a couple of things that I've done to sort of point out just how racial illiterate that we've become. I've had conversations about race with kindergartners, and kindergartners haven't learned yet to censor themselves. And so,
How does that go?
oh, it goes fantastic. It goes fabulous, because, asking questions about, like, so what do you think about how Black people are treated in the world? And some of the answers that come from these 5-year-olds is like, we wish that Black people would be treated so badly. Why is it that we see the police officers always picking on Black people? And they'll say it just like that. White kids, Black kids, just like that. Because they haven't learned to censor themselves, and they see things for what they are. And so, but through the process, I argue that, the further up we go in grades and on the, college level, and then your doctoral programs, becomes much more difficult, because we've been socialized to censor ourselves in ways that we can't say what we truly feel. And so I believe that when we get to being adults, that we have been trained not to. We've been made racially illiterate. So when we decide to delve into this work, we have to give ourselves the right to do things wrong. So I tell my students, you're going to do things wrong 9 times in order to get it right to 10th, and that's difficult, but that's what we have to do at our age, considering we haven't been taught how to do it well.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned in the book is actually something that Nick and I had been discussing with our coursework, and centered around a presentation that we did for the class, was housing discrimination and the impact that it has on education. So through your research and through what you've included in the book, how do you explain the impact of housing discrimination on education in particular?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a practitioner and you've been across a number of different school districts, and even a number of different schools, that housing discrimination and historical racial segregation, residential racial segregation, has had an effect on a number of things, and one of which being education. And the sort of the foundation of that is around funding. That we still know in the majority of states and majority of districts, we fund schools partly through property tax. And if we've redlined for a long time, meaning that we've kept Black and brown residents out of a particular area and cordoned them off to area of the city or a particular neighborhood that is the undesirable area, because white people typically don't want to live in Black neighborhoods, that drives down the housing value, which in the property tax is a lot lower than your middle to high income sort of desirable white areas. Not because these people necessarily make less money, but because they have less desirable residential areas. And so at the very foundation, in terms of funding, the history of redlining and the contemporary sort of residuals of de jure segregation, that now is sort of de facto segregation, leaves schools highly under-resourced. And what does this bring? What does this bring along with the under-resourced schools and the differential in resources? One, in your less resourced schools, ones that don't have as many resources as the middle to high income schools, it brings teachers that have less experience. Because if you're teaching so here in North Carolina, we grade schools, we label schools by grade. You're in an A school, a C school, an F school. Most experienced teachers don't want to work in an F school, because that sticks to you, that sticks to your record. So where are they going to go? To middle to high income schools that are A and B schools. So you have a less experienced teaching corps. And then at the same time, if you have a less experienced teaching corps who don't want to be at that school necessarily, you have a principal that typically has less experience. And so it's not so much just the lack of adequate funding, but it's also the lack of adequate human resources. And this is a cycle that continues until we figure out how to, one, recognize that this is a pattern, and it directly relates to our sort of continued residential segregation, because we're not going to solve that anytime soon. That's going to take a
Right,
larger effort. But we
right.
realize that a lot of our underachievement in schools is it's sort of a direct line to de jure racial segregation. We have to think about what are the resources that are now needed from the school districts to then, level the playing field.
I'm sorry I don't know this, but in North Carolina, how do they draw up the school boundaries? Because like this problem is pronounced where we're from, because our districts are so narrowly defined by basically the small towns that you live in. So the de facto segregation has I mean, we have two towns near us, Garden City and Hempstead. One is the wealthiest town, and one's probably the poorest. And the kids are living, they're next door to each other.
Right.
I mean, and yet they can't, and those kids can't go to that school. But in North Carolina, are your districts drawn wider than that?
It depends on where you're on the city. So Charlotte Mecklenburg schools, we have a huge city, we have a huge school district, but then it goes by town. And so most of the towns are rather small. So they have your typical like maybe 6 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 1 high school. And so that's the typical layout of most districts across North Carolina that aren't rural schools. Because in some rural towns you have an elementary school, then the next town has a middle school and the high
Miles and
school.
miles, right?
Yeah. So we do have that in the sort of the more dense populated areas, as in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. We have a number of school districts that border Charlotte Mech, and so you'll have schools from 2 different counties and 2 different school districts that are funded way differently because of the segregation. And it's stark. It's stark. You could drive, a half hour down the road to 2 elementary schools and have completely different resources.
Obviously, one of the major themes of your book is to create conversations that will hopefully lead to the elimination of unconscious bias over hopefully not too much time. What role do you think the internet and social media play? Do you think that they're helping or hindering the movement to eradicate unconscious bias?
I mean, it's something where I think the more communication we have, the better it's going to be for us to have these conversations. And so what we need to understand is all of our media outlets are racially biased. There's a lot of research about just the in terms of television, just about how much screen and airtime people of color get or don't get, and the way that people of color are portrayed, especially Black men, are portrayed on the news. So there's a study that shows that. The amount of news coverage given to the crime of Black citizens is like 100-fold over the given population, wherein white crime is not even is barely covered, and if it is covered, they typically don't show the picture of the white perpetrator, but they show
Or the perp walk, right? I've,
right.
I've seen statistics like that. Yes, it's unbelievable. Yeah.
So we have to remember that one, Black people only represent 13% of the U.S. population. And in terms of crime statistics, numerically, we don't even come close to the crimes of white people. But you would think by watching our news media that we commit more crimes and we represent a larger part of the U.S. population. And so just those images that we're subject to on the regular basis play a role in shaping our racial biases over time. And this happens from the time that we are, 3, 4, and 5 years old, all the way throughout our lives. And so all of our media outlets, social media, television, print media, they're all racially biased. And so on one, I think they are contribute to the issue, but two, just for like podcasts like this, where we're able to have these conversations about race, where if you flash back to the time that I was in high school, wasn't around back in the early '90s. We wouldn't be having this conversation across the country and then having people just to press a button and listen in. And so I think it's helping in ways of spreading these the need for these types of conversations, but it's also we have to recognize that media is also racially biased.
And what about just the various websites and chat rooms and comment bars that where people feel like they can fire off the most vitriolic, you know, hate speech and so on, or find like-minded, close-minded individuals. That's sort of my concern about social media and the internet is that it it allows you to create an echo chamber for yourself if you desire that. And while on one hand, of course, people can listen in and with a click and listen to this conversation, it's just as easy for them to block this conversation and only fill themselves with sort of this closed-mindedness that perpetuates their own particular worldview without trying to expand beyond it.
Yeah, I hear you. I don't know what we really do about that, right? Because we have the reach now, so we can actually talk to exponentially more people than we could have, say, 20 years ago. And at the same time, how are we using that to then, connect with people not like us? Because I know at least from it's very easy for me to be friends on Facebook with folks who think like me and block out because it's comfortable. Why would you want to have uncomfortable conversations with folks who, in your free time on Facebook, on social media? And one of my
Right.
goals is, and I talk about this in our first chapter. We talk about, second chapter we talk about start with ourselves and realize what are our limitations in terms of judging the other, whatever the other is. Someone who has a different political opinion or different opinion on race or different sort of religion, something that we firmly disagree with. How do we create a forum where we can talk? We can talk like adults, and we can talk in a way that we can agree to disagree, but we can get to learn more about the other. And so one of my my goals, and I haven't had the opportunity yet. I need to be more purposeful about this because I constantly work on myself as I'm doing consulting. So I realize what I'm asking people to do. And so I try my best because I travel a lot is to connect with someone who believes that we should have full rights to own firearms. Because as an educator, as a former elementary school teacher, I believe we need to have a lot more restrictions on firearms because just we were overrun with shootings in schools. And so I just sincerely do not understand about how we continue to have these mass shootings every year in places of business, in schools where we send our little ones to learn for 8 hours a day. How we can agree with having people have the right to bear arms, just like basically without any sort of controls on it, but then knowing that we're sending our little ones off to learn in a place where they could be killed. And I want to learn, and even though I disagree right now, I still want to learn more from someone who believes in that and where it comes from, and so I can have more of a balanced understanding of someone who's a very, very much a supporter of the right to bear arms.
Well, I think young people definitely would concur with your feelings on that as well. And I just wanted to, I agree with what you both said about the internet and the impact of social media. I don't have a major social media presence, but I'm aware of just how incredibly damaging it is in this topic. But one positive I've seen, like the impact just of Netflix. I mean, the Central Park Five series. I can't believe how many kids came back into class and were really having discussions about the racism that played out in that case. So I wonder if even shows like that and more documentaries and the streaming services could actually work in our favor in this discussion.
I agree. I agree because I mean it's more readily available, readily accessible. That folks can, in typical scrolling through Netflix, which is something we wouldn't even thought of 20 years ago.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be a big blockbuster documentary. It could be something as small as the Central Park Five documentary or the 13th. The 13th is by Ava DuVernay. It's a
She's
very
brilliant.
powerful documentary.
Brilliant.
It's amazing, and you learn so much. I mean, I learned so much from watching. I've watched it twice, just about the sort of history of our country and where we need to go. So it gives us more fodder for thought, and I think we're going to see the fruits of these. So these sort of the increased connection that we have in our society through folks who've only known this. This has been their world. And what's interesting about those folks where this has always been their world, these are the same people that in their formative years only had a black president. So we have to think about this generation, you know, that that for 8 years, we had a national conversation around race because we had a black president. And now, even though we're having a conversation about race in a different way, we're having the race with the sort of the antithesis of what we had before. So I have a lot of hope for the folks who are right now in high school, upper elementary school and high school, because their concept of race and what's possible as a society is a lot different from ours. And so I wonder what it's going to look like in 20 years.
When you say that, it reminds me of something that you had mentioned in the book, which is that often there's this sort of additional pressure on people of color to take on more of a lead or a teaching role when it comes to engaging in these conversations on race and racism. So, can you elaborate a little bit more on what those pressures entail?
Yeah, I mean, it's something we write about, and there's a lot of articles on what we refer to as racial battle fatigue. Because people of color, I'm not gonna just generalize, but I'm gonna say from African American people and the African Americans I know in my circle, we talk about racism, you know, daily, if not, it's just a normal part of conversation and talking about race. And in terms of, I have a son who's 18 right now, and he's a a black male, and so we'd have to have the conversation around him being a black male in school with him about the racism that he might encounter. And when he does encounter racism, helping him talk through that so it doesn't affect his self-esteem. He realizes it's connected to his color. When he started driving, there's been a rash of shootings of unarmed black men. We had to have conversation about how to interact with police. And so having this as an upbringing in a black household, will make him, and it made me also as a young black man, more comfortable with talking about race. And so, given that most white people, from what we've learned, what I've learned through the readings that Sarah has recommended that I read, is most white people don't talk about race nearly as frequently in their home life, among their friend circles, in their social circles, as much as people of color. So, people of color typically have a higher threshold for discomfort and more dexterity in talking about race. And so when there's levels of either interpersonal racism or unintentional interpersonal racism, black and brown people often carry the burden of teaching white people about what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and then how to then say things or do things in a different way. And then also, what the sort of the drawback of this is that especially in racially heterogeneous groups. So when you have black and brown folks and white folks together, what often happens is that white folks who are uncomfortable with talking about race sit back and listen and let the black and brown people then take up the airspace, which is one I think is a good thing. But what happens here is that the black and brown people don't get to learn from the white perspective. And so when I hold workshops and when I hold discussions, I pause purposefully so that it's a 50-50 conversation where even if a white person says, I have nothing to say, I don't understand race, I say, elaborate on that. Because we need to have an interracial dialogue in which you participate, even though you think you might not have stuff to add. The black and brown folks need to learn from you and need to hear white people say, even if they feel uncomfortable, unprepared. I haven't had these conversations. I don't know what to say. To continue to talk through that, so we have a mutual level of understanding of each other across racial lines.
Part of that might be because of the infrequency that white people engage in these kinds of conversations. They're afraid to say something that could potentially be deemed offensive or wrong, and don't want to be mistaken for, as you mentioned in the book countless times, be mistaken for a racist. No, that's not me. Sometimes the safest thing to do is to say nothing at all, just so you avoid the possibility of that horrible moment where you've said something that offends someone or lands awkwardly.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you bring that up because that's something we talk about in our book, especially in chapter 2, and then we lead into chapter 5 where it says, "Whose comfort are we prioritizing?" So
Right.
often, we're in these conversations we prioritize the comfort of white people, where black and brown people in our way of talking about something that very much implicates us and affects us in the everyday, we're very uncomfortable because not only do we experience racism, but yet we have to carry the conversation around racism. So we explain that in chapter 5 about sort of the uneven responsibility towards talking about race. But in chapter 2, we introduce this concept that Robin DiAngelo talks about, is this concept of the good non-racist, bad racist binary.
Yes.
And that's often the biggest barrier in any of these conversations. So what you just said in terms of I might say something that makes me look racist, is sort of this mindset that we are this mindset of being trapped in the binary. So either you're a good non-racist, that means you're liberal, you're open-minded, you're not racist at all, or you are a bad racist where you are, a white nationalist, you're a KKK member, you're purposefully racist, and you're bad. And so what we need to think about is that there really is no binary. We're all on a continuum of racial identity development. It's understanding ourselves as a racialized person, and and there is no bad racist. There is no. They're just really early on in their racial identity development, and so these are people are still learners, even though they might say things offensive, right? And so,
Right.
if we think about ourselves on this continuum and keep that front of mind and actually introduce this concept during a conversation, hopefully that will bring down the barriers that if you do say something out of ignorance that might be perceived as racist, we have to have the generosity to say, you know what, you're on your racial identity development journey, and we need to have a difficult conversation around that. You're not a bad racist. You're just developing. we all have ingested racial bias. We have all ingested racial bias, even people of color, because we're all subject to the same stimuli over a lifetime. So we've developed these biases, and so we're not, if we don't pay attention, we're going to act those out. And so we're all on a racialized identity development continuum, and we're all working on it together. And so, being that, we all have racism, so no one's exempt, and that's okay.
I don't know if we've gotten to the personal confessions part of the podcast, but when I started reading the book, I did consider myself one of the "that's not me" people. Um, I had a very diverse experience growing up in schools that I went to and my friend groups and so on. But by the time I finished the book, I really truly believe that I was on the continuum like everybody else, and that I can't dismiss the possibility of unconscious bias, and I just can't fit in the "it's not me" category anymore. So thank you for that. Again, I don't know if we're up to the confessional part, but
Awesome.
consider that my confession. I'm sorry, Nick, I cut you off.
No, and I'm just going to add everything I've read, by you and about you. And that to me is the most impressive aspect of what you're trying to contribute, because we don't want to alienate anyone. We want to embrace. I assume that's how you feel.
Right.
And I think what you're doing is you're trying to bring everybody along, and you're being understanding and patient, but at the same time calling out when people like Marc and I, who both think that we're decent people, but you're right, we're on this journey. I think that's just so critical, because I don't want to be alienated by people that are doing this work either. I want everybody to come along on the same page. So I really think it's very impressive how you're approaching it and how you articulate it as well. It's very impressive.
I appreciate that. Well, thank you. I mean, that was the goal of the book, is try to be as inclusive as possible, because you can't lead for racial equity if no one's following you. If you've alienated everyone who's behind you, you're just taking a walk, right? And so that's part of doing the work, is having the humility to say, I don't get it right all the time, but I know that I want to be on the path. And I want to say to those who are listening, like, I don't get it right all the time. I do a lot of talks. I do a lot of workshops. I work with individuals on the racial identity development, and I still don't get it right. But that I would rather get it wrong, a couple of times in order to get it right, rather than not do it at all.
I agree with that. And one of the things that you provided in the book was a tool that people could use. I think it was Glenn Singleton's racial consciousness flowchart that you had called out in the book. So can you explain what that is and why that is an effective tool to help people engage in these conversations?
Right. There are a number of different frameworks we can use to think about. We can learn to think about our concepts of race. So yes, Glenn Singleton's flowchart is one of them. You also have Peggy McIntosh and unpacking the white privilege knapsack. I think that was called. And then you have Robin DiAngelo and white fragility. So whatever sort of the framing that we use around thinking about race, using a framework to understanding our racialized being is sort of the foundation of raising our consciousness and awareness that we all live a very racialized life, and most of the time, in terms of white people, very unconsciously, but a lot of our decisions, the way we think about things, are based in race. And so Glenn, he agreed to write the forward to our book, because I said, folks who go through your Courageous Conversations trainings and they agreed to start having conversations around that, fantastic. That is the first step. And then the next step is to pick up our book, because that's the consciousness and awareness raising around, okay, I live a racialized life. Race and racism have an impact on our society, everyone on our society. Now the question is like, what then do we do? Then you pick up our book. Now you got the do, and what do you do in schools about it?
To that point, you mentioned the culture of brave in your book. So how do we all go ahead and try to establish this culture of brave in our schools and in our faculty rooms? How do we go ahead and try to establish that?
Yeah, I mean, we have to realize that our schools are racialized, and students and teachers have a racialized experience, and so we're all invested in doing what's best for our students and our families and our communities, and so we have access. And so someplace we say start in chapter 6 and chapter 7, and you can and this could be a place for starting a brave community, is one. Read a piece on sort of the racial framing of schools and students' experience. So we could start with at the base level of like understanding ourselves as a racialized person, and then also study understanding that race is at play in our schools, just as a general sense, not implicating anyone. But then to make it real is disaggregating our data by race and gender. We typically, unless it's high stakes testing, we typically don't disaggregate attendance data. We don't disaggregate sometimes discipline data. We don't
Definitely
typically,
discipline data for
yeah,
sure. Yeah.
Dibble, the Dibbles data, disaggregated by race and gender, doing classroom observations with a racialized lens, like who is participating the most, who's getting called on, who's not getting called on, doing things through a racial lens that give us a picture of how race is at play in our schools. And when we find um, gaps in the data, whether it's by race and gender or race and gender together, when we find gaps in our data, saying, not looking for the excuse and explaining it away, because this is what we typically do, right? So I've heard these excuses of, there's maybe an academic issue in a particular grade among students of color and white students, and we'll hear, well, they're poor, and they don't have enough resources at home, and so that's why they're achieving differently. Or their family engagement is a very popular one right now. Like, well, if their families were more engaged, if you could reach their parents, and they would be performing better. So instead of looking for the excuses, this is something we talked about in chapter 9. Look for ways in which the system could be producing these outcomes. Because there's one study that we talk about. It didn't make it to the book, but it's a very important study. And this study involved a group of teachers. And so what the study was about is that these researchers took a poorly written essay, and they got the group of teachers together, and they gave the teachers the poorly written essay.
Where did they find a poorly written essay? No, sorry.
Yeah, actually, they wrote it themselves, but I mean, you can
Okay.
find it at any given school. But they wrote it themselves, a very poorly written essay. And the instructions to the teacher was to give the students a rating on the essay, and then also give them feedback in order to help them improve on the paper, right? And so the only information they had about the student was their name, their race, and their gender. That's all they had: name, race, and gender. That's the only information they had from about the student. These are fictitious students. And so when the graded essays came back, what the researchers found was that, one, if the students were white, if they were identified as white, the trend was teachers would give them a lower rating, more critical feedback, and less positive feedback. Okay, but if the essays were from a Hispanic student or a Black student, the teachers gave the essay a higher rating, less critical feedback, and more positive feedback. And so what does this tell us? What this tells us is the teachers have higher expectations for the white students because they give them a lower grade and more critical feedback to make it better. However, if you're a Black or Hispanic student, oh wow, instead of the lower rating, you get a higher grade because this is the best you can do.
So it's good for you. It's not
good
necessarily
for you.
good, but it's good for you.
It's good for your intellect, what we believe
Oh
your
my
intellectual
God.
capacity is. And so
Who
we're
was
going to
grading these tests? Jimmy the Greek?
These are regular teachers. And so so this is why it's important that we begin to investigate how racial bias is playing out, not if. So there's not an if. So we have to believe that racial bias is playing out when there are gaps in wherever they are, and then finding out where they exist. And then in terms of like the initial question about what's creating a brave community, is just going forward with it. Like, it's going to be tough. It's going to be emotional. There might be some tears. There might be some anger. There might be some resistance. These are the emotions that come along with being implicated in possibly, having internalized racism, but pushing through that to see progress. And that's what is involved in being cultivating a brave community.
That's really some study. I wonder, are you familiar with the controversy in New York City now with the selective high school entrance exams? Have you heard about this?
I do have a close friend who's there, whose daughter's going into high school, but I would love for you to explain this to me. How does this work out?
So, basically, there are considered like 8 high schools in New York City that are considered, prestigious or the most selective, public schools. And the only criteria they use is this test that the students take in 8th grade. So obviously students of means and resource, regardless of their race, they're starting the test prep, in 6th grade with all the tutors and programs and things like that. And they've noticed that the overwhelming number of students accepted are white and Asian. So the mayor and the chancellor have tried to alter it so that they use middle school grades as more of a factor, and there would be more racial diversity. The backlash was enormous, and this past year, Stuyvesant High School, which is one of the top schools, I think 8 Black students were accepted for the entire freshman class.
In a city of 1.1 million students.
Right. So there's been a lot of a lot written about it. I guess well, obviously my feeling is I don't know why we only have 8 schools that feel, that people feel that they can send their students to get a good education.
Right.
But there's been, I've heard, both sides of should they be using more of the grades in middle school or should they be using this exam? That's the basic part of the debate.
Yeah, and what I would say to that is like what I talk about when it comes to sort of disparate outcomes in data is that where there's smoke, there's fire. There's racial bias there in some way.
Right.
There cannot be a gap of intelligence that grand just biologically, right?
Of
There's
course.
something
Yeah.
that's a part of the system that is selecting out Black and Hispanic students. And then on top of that, the technical solution that they've chose to do is to admit more Black and brown students in some way. But I argue that that might be actually defeatist in terms of achieving the real goal, in terms of where in the system is the system racially biased? Where is it? And locating that and to create a more equitable system. Now, this technical solution of admitting just a quota number of Black and brown students doesn't solve for the system. And two, these students are now entering a racially hostile environment. So if you all know, everybody knows. And these students are now going to this school that's predominantly white and Asian, and racial bias is at play in that school very, very strongly because there's very few of them. And one of these teachers unconsciously going to think about them. Did you get in because of affirmative action? Are you as qualified? And this then acts out in the classroom and throughout the school day. So these students who've been admitted, I feel for them. One, there's a lot of pressure because you have been let in, and everyone knows that you're in there. And at the same time, you're going to have to single-handedly weather the racially hostile environment until is a better critical mass of Black and brown students in that school.
And to further that, you really run the risk of students feeling or experiencing stereotype threat, which is nothing necessarily has to even happen in a negative way in their experience, but their perception that they're not necessarily supposed to be there, that alone could impact negatively how they perform.
And I can't imagine the number of students who didn't get into that school, and now that story's around, the white students who didn't get in, and the white families that their children didn't get in, they're sort of waiting and seeing like how these black and brown students, I mean, how are they going to do? There's a sort of a hope that they're just not a fit. So because when it comes to this sort of idea of affirmative action, it always produces this backlash of intense anger of white students who didn't get in, who thought that these black students are taking their spots, And so I think I hope there's more consideration being given to how to best right the system rather than this technical solution of just giving away seats in the current system. So Mark and Nick, you guys are on that. You're gonna solve that by next week.
Yeah, I just fired off an email, so I think we're all set. Did you derive any motivation for creating the ethnic studies course at Harvard from Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States? Because when I read the description, it sounded a little bit like it had a similar type of concept behind it.
Yeah, there's some Zen in there. I do know some Zen, so he's up there percolating somewhere in terms of design of ethnic studies. But ethnic study was a purposeful effort in a historically white institution, and so we're so used to saying HBCU, historically black institution, when it comes to black colleges. But we got to realize there's a lot of historically white institutions that have particular histories, and so Harvard's one of those places. And in the ed school, and considering that we're preparing people, I think the moniker is or the motto is learn to change the world. And so myself, Cesar Cruz, and Sang Q, the three of us were in our program, and we noticed that our curriculum didn't involve studying populations of color. And the majority of the literature and research that we read was deficit laden. About it just described the deficits of communities of color. And so we felt that it was necessary for students who come in either for a master's or for a doctorate or a doctorate at Harvard to have the option to take a class that's asset-based, where they learn the histories of Latinos, of Blacks, of Asians, and of Native Americans. We're going to cram that all into one semester. And then also, so maybe when they graduate, they have a different perspective going into being leaders of schools and school districts. And so that was the idea behind formulating the class. I was the add-on in the team because actually Cesar Cruz were the brainchild. And they were on, Cesar and Sang were on first, but they added me on because one, I was interested in Black education, and then also because we had the will to push in curriculum, and so we worked very hard with the assistant dean. We made many pitches to the dean. We fought very hard. We taught it ourselves the first year, and in my program, the EDLD program, that's just not something that happens. It's a 3-year accelerated doctorate, which is very intense. But we took on our own time and taught the class for 70 students, and then we found a way to recommend a sustainability plan, and we sold it to the acting dean, and they chose to keep it on, luckily, so that students, it's just one course, but students who opt to can choose to take an asset-based course so that they can think more about the strengths of communities that we often talk so poorly about in education.
That's phenomenal.
Wow.
And just a perfect example of unconscious bias as it fits into Harvard University and the curriculum and course offerings there. It's kind of your book coming full circle in some way.
So in terms of looking at programs in higher education, I have a tremendous amount of what I say is understanding and generosity for their way of thinking in these historically white institutions. Because typically at the table when these programs were founded, either the Master's in Education or PhD in Education program, there were likely very few people of color around the table, vouching for and vying for curriculum that's not deficit laden. And so I've experienced this at Wisconsin, my undergrad institution, at UNC Chapel Hill, my master's program, and also at Harvard, and also here at UNC Charlotte. That a lot of the education programs are based in a frame that are either one was supposedly race neutral, which doesn't exist, but racially sanitized. And then if it does include a course on either cultural competency or leading for social justice, it uses a lot of deficit laden research. And so it's baked into our system, where we need to sort of be purposeful about understanding the deficit laden nature of the way in which we talk about Black and brown communities, and slowly transition ourselves to be more asset based, to realize there's a lot of strengths here, and the system is actually the one to implicate, as our book is all about, is implicating the system as the one producing the achievement gap, and not so much the communities.
You have, I probably would you would agree, more academic freedom on the college level to pursue those pursuits. On the high school level or middle school level, do you think we should be working more with out of the classroom workshops to do this type of work? Should it be incorporated into the curriculum with teachers, with students? What do you think is the best approach to take with this?
I mean, there's so much to do. So our book is around, preparing the leader, one, to understand more about how to lead to racial equity, and then working with teachers because they're the closest touch point to students through using data and through communication and cultivating a brave community. However, if we're thinking about a more holistic approach, this is something that we did at my high school, with our provider was Multicultural Bridge, and they're out of Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And Gwen Van Sant, she's the CEO of Multicultural Bridge. They came in and they did a series of trainings for the teachers, for me too. I needed trainings also, but then they also did trainings with the students, the entire student body. We had a couple of whole school assemblies around. I forget the titles of them, but it was around being a more understanding and inclusive community. And they also started a student group, a volunteer student group after school, to then continue the work. So I think it can be a holistic wraparound program, that if we realize that our schools are racially sanitized, to then create a program that's purposeful and that can be systematized, that we can do year after year. It's not the flyby. Let's find a provider this year for 2-day PD. Great, he or she came, and we're on to the next thing. That we can systematize it so we can own it at the school level.
Yeah, that's great.
To close our conversation, the last chapter of your book is entitled "Go Slow to Go Far." Can you explain what that means in terms of addressing unconscious bias and how that can, in a sense, provide a roadmap for all of us in doing this kind of work?
Yeah, so I mean, we that was added on at the end because, and you all know this, in education we like answers and we like them now. Tell us what to do. Teachers want to know if we're having a PD. All right, what am I going to get from it? What can I enact today? How are you? I don't want to waste my time sitting here when I have either papers to grade or lesson plans to develop. And so what we encourage folks to do is say, it's taken us a long, long time to get where we are. And so we hearken back to, the hundreds of years of oppression in our country, and then residuals that we have today. And the amount of the time that we had in legalized oppression is far longer than the time we have now. So it's going to take more than 1 year to solve sort of the deep-seated issues of racism in our society. And so going slow to go far means that we need to be very purposeful in everything we do, and not just going for the easy, quick fix. So it's so very popular to have like 10 PD days during the school year. And so we're just going to have 2 dedicated days of all-day trainings, of really intense, training on race and education, and be, uncomfortable for that day. And everyone's going to have such a horrible experience with it that they're not going to want to touch it again. And so this is a multi-year process, and where we need to have a long-term strategy around how we're going to be purposeful in implementing things where we're going to actually see change, and not just talk about it and exist in feelings. And also transitioning from our sort of popular programs, which are, we have popular programs such as restorative justice. We have programs, which is again a way to say we have issues with like racial disparities, but yet we're going to implement this coverall strategy that doesn't address unconscious bias or racism. We have tier 2 instruction that really doesn't focus on the core of the classroom where the racial bias exists. We have, extended school day. Let's just extend the school day and maybe that'll work. And what we argue is that we have to actually address the racial bias within the school day that's happening during the normal classes, because all these other add-ons are trying to solve for an issue that already exists. So it's a cyclical problem. And so we need to be very intentional and have a laser-like focus on where we're going to address the bias, and then solve it there, and then move on to the next. So be very slow, arduous, purposeful in managing our purpose as the process goes along. And so going slow it should be kept in mind that it's not going to be solved within a year or a semester. It's going to take multiple years to really be purposeful and institutionalize the practices.
Wow. Well, I could talk and listen to you all day, but I'm going to say sincerely and genuinely, I don't know what you're looking to add to your resume, but we need you to be our next Secretary of Education. I mean that, Dr. Benson. I'm going to make my students listen to this, because they hear me talk about how disappointed I am with all of the Secretaries of Education. I apologize for that, but I just don't think any of them truly grasp, not only what's going on in schools, but what we need to do to move forward. And I think you are the absolute perfect person that this country needs for this role. So I don't know if you want that role, but I'm throwing it out there because I really believe that you are the perfect fit for that.
I thank you for the vote of confidence, Nick. I'll see how warm the seat is once Betsy leaves. We'll see what's going on.
But if it happens, I will be on record as predicting it, just so you know.
I will come back. I will find you. I'll be like, this is the guy.
Oh, believe me, he'll find you first.
Awesome. I thank you for that vote of confidence. Goodness, it feels good.
Well, Dr. Benson, thank you so much. This really has been an enlightening conversation, and definitely one that's important. And I already made my confession, so no need to repeat it. But this is really a wonderful book. This is Dr. Benson's book, Unconscious Bias in Schools, a Developmental Approach to Exploring Race and Racism. And we'll put a link in our show notes so you can pick up a copy of the book from Amazon or wherever else books are sold. You could also find Dr. Benson on Twitter at Dr. Tracey Benson. And if you'd like to follow our podcast, we're on Apple Podcasts. You could also find us on the web, stateofedpodcast.com, where you'll find some of the links that we discussed on the show. If you'd like to pick up a copy of my book after you've read Dr. Benson's book, it's Forward Fast, Making Sense of Education in an Era of Rapid Change, also wherever books are sold. And I'm on Twitter at Marc6, or you can find me on the web at marc6.com. Dr. Benson, thank you so much for your time and for the enlightening chat.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you. You guys have been awesome. I really appreciate you having me and this topic on your show. I feel very blessed and honored.
Thank you very much.